Morning, Boker Tov, and welcome back to the Mishkan Katan studio. It's always a joy to be with you each week and to either study the scripture or to focus on what I've been focusing on lately, which is the trip that I took to Israel in June. So I'm headed around third base, headed for home in that travel log. And today we're going to resume with day 12. But first of all, I want to do just a brief commercial to tell you about a special event that we're going to be having here on the Lamb Messianic Network in November. If you poke around on the site when I'm not broadcasting, when other people are broadcasting, you'll probably see a promo for this. It's going to be a special event where several of us content producers, as we're called, will be doing special presentations during that period on the theme of dry bones. You know, the chapter in Ezekiel, I think it's 37, 38, somewhere around in there, talking about the valley of dry bones. And I actually woke up in the night last night thinking about what I'm going to teach on during that special event. I'm excited about that. So I hope you'll watch the promo and mark your calendars and come join us during that special time. So check that out. I've also posted it on my Facebook page, Resplendent Daughter Ministries. So you can go watch the promo there and make your plans to join us. I'm sure you'll receive a blessing. So we're going to go ahead this morning and go back to Israel. I'm going to go in my memories and I'm going to take you with me. I got a message the other day from one of my college roommates, of all things, and she and her beloved are over there in Israel right now, and they're touring with a friend of mine. They hired a private tour guide, and he's excellent. If you want to see Israel in a very up close and personal way, then I can give you some recommendations for some wonderful people to help you see it and experience it how you want to experience it. You can just contact me. And you can do that through my Facebook page or through my blog, either one. My blog is www.resplendentdaughter.blogspot.com. So just send me a message and I'll send you some contacts. I've been 3 times now, and I'm a little bit jealous of my friends because they got to go to some places recently in the past few days that even I've not gotten to go to, and there are a lot of places I haven't gotten to go to. Don't get me wrong, but today we're going to plunge in and look at some places I did get to go to. All right. So without further ado, this was day 12 of my 14-day trip. And we started the day off by going past the Knesset to the Israel Museum. Now, the Knesset, if you're not familiar with that term, is a governing body in Israel. It's roughly analogous to Parliament in Canada or England, or Congress in the United States of America. And I say roughly analogous because the governments of these two countries are not the same, Israel and the United States, or Canada or England for that matter. They share some common characteristics, but they also are quite different. By the way, I also clicked a button on my production screen here so that I can see comments. I want to thank you for making comments on my show last week. I had some wonderful comments. I appreciate that. And if you want to make comments today, I'll look at them after the show. I can't respond to them during the broadcast for obvious reasons. That's way too much for me to handle. Okay. I'm not nearly that good. So, at any rate, we passed by the building where the Knesset meets, and you can walk from the Knesset to the Israel Museum. It's very close together. And so we spent all morning there, at the Israel Museum. And our first stop that day was to visit a huge model. It's about 1,000 meters square. And of course, a meter is roughly equivalent to a foot. So if you're not good at metric system, like I'm not, a meter, I take that back. A meter is bigger than a foot. A meter is roughly equivalent to 3 feet, right? So I'd say then if it was 1,000 meters, well, you can do the math. All right. There's a reason I don't teach math online. Okay. And if you had any reason to doubt why I don't teach math online, there you go. Exhibit A. All right. So anyway, this thing was about 1,000 meters square, and it's a model of ancient Jerusalem, how Jerusalem would have looked in the first century, around 66 CE, Common Era. All right. And this model was built as a memorial. It was constructed between 1964 and 1969. And it was done by the owner at that time of the Holy Land Hotel, which was a very prominent hotel in the 1960s. And the man built it as a legacy. And I'm so glad he did. It's a wonderful model. It's not entirely accurate, but it's still a wonderful model to explore. Well, when he began this work, the Israeli Jews could not even enter the old city of Jerusalem. And that's because the old city of Jerusalem was in the country of Jordan, at the time. Now, in the days that the Hebrew people conquered Canaan, they didn't conquer Jerusalem for quite some time. They entered the land with Joshua, but it wasn't until King David came along that they possessed Jerusalem. And it's a similar type of situation when the Jews returned to the land of Israel in 1947-48 and began to set up government. For the first almost 20 years, they could not enter the old city of Jerusalem. It was inhabited by Arabs, mostly Catholic Arabs. And it wasn't until 1967, in the 6-Day War, when it was concluded that the Jews possessed Jerusalem once again, and it was part of the newly reformed country of Israel. A lot of people don't know that. So when the model was started at the Israel Museum, and I'm not sure that it was actually built there or if it was moved there, but I know it was started in 1964. And before it was completed, the Jews once again possessed the city, the old city of Jerusalem. I have a friend who was born in October of 67. So he was conceived in Jordan, but he was born in Israel, and his parents never moved. So it was an interesting situation in those days, to be sure. All right. Now, the wall of the old city was built in 3 sections. The first section was constructed by whom? Do you know? King Solomon. And then Herod the Great built the second section of the city wall. And then King Herod Agrippa I came along and built the third section, which was the north and northeastern sections of the temple complex. Now, when the Romans attacked in the Roman War, the Jewish-Roman War of the anywhere, I don't remember which year it started exactly, but I believe it started in 67 Common Era. If that's not right, it's very close. And then Jerusalem fell in 70 CE. Of that date, I'm certain. And Masada, the last fortress out near the Dead Sea, we talked about Masada a few broadcasts ago, it fell in 74 CE. So when the Romans attacked, where did they break through the city wall of the old city? They broke through the northeast section, the newest section. And you might think, well, that's strange. Wouldn't that be the best fortified section? No, it would not. And it was not. It was, in fact, not as well built as the older sections were, despite being newer. And it was great to see in one large model, as we were looking at this, the places we had visited over the past 5 days or so, or at least the ruins of those. Now, I mentioned that there are some inaccuracies in this model, so let me just go over some of those with you this morning. They have a tomb marked as David's tomb, and it's not. His tomb would have been in the city of David, not in the upper city, which is where they have the tomb in the model. The same is true with the tomb of Huldah, which is positioned in front of the southern wall. Excavations have occurred in that area looking for her grave, and none have been found. That's because she wasn't buried there. Now, who was Huldah? Some of you who have not studied much about Jewish history or the ancillary Jewish writings outside the Tanakh, outside the Old Testament, may not know who Huldah was. But Huldah was a famous Jewish prophetess. She lived in the 7th century BCE, around the time of King Josiah. And in Judaism, she is very highly regarded. She was one of 7 women prophets or prophetesses, and she reportedly descended from Joshua, as well as being a relative of Jeremiah. Yeremiyahu is how you say Jeremiah in Hebrew. I tell my Christian friends who get all bent out of shape when they feel like they've mispronounced a name in the Tanakh, I say, don't worry about it, because how we say it in English is wrong anyway. So even if you say it as is purported to be correct in English, you're still going to be wrong unless you say it in Hebrew. So don't worry. Just say those names the best you can and journey on, pilgrim, journey on. So another error in the model is that one of the southern face of the wall's triple gates, one of the gates is missing. There's a triple gate in the southern wall. And in the model, that triple gate only has 2 gates. Well, why in the world would that be, you may ask? Well, it's only because in recent years, since the model was finished, that it was discovered that there was a 3rd gate in that triple gate, and they all look like little arches, like 1, 2, 3, all side by side. So together you have here's a double gate, and you put another one off to the side, and you've got a triple gate. Okay, well, the triple gate that was most recently discovered was the agricultural gate of that triple gate. And that was the gate outside of which there was a ramp, a big ramp leading down to street level. And it was up that ramp that the offering animals were led into the temple complex and put into a holding area until time for them to be offered on the great altar of sacrifice. So again, that gate was only recently discovered. All right. Now, on the south side, there's also a single gate in the city wall, and that was called the Gate of the Essenes. The Gate of the Essenes. In 25 BC, the Essenes withdrew from the Sanhedrin. Now, again, this is about 20 years before the birth of Yeshua. Various scholars put his birth as anywhere from 5 BCE to 0. The ones I tend to put stock in are 5 or 4 BCE. Okay. But in 25 BCE, the Essenes withdrew from the Sanhedrin along with the disciples of a very famous rabbi named Hillel the Elder. And they withdrew to Qumran. Qumran. Now you spell Qumran, Qumran. Qumran. Some of you may have never heard of this place, but it's out in the desert near the Dead Sea. And why did they do this? Why this schism? And it was a big schism in the Sanhedrin. Well, before they withdrew, you had Hillel the Elder, who was a very influential rabbi in the Sanhedrin, and you had a guy named Shammai. Shammai held somewhat different interpretations of the Torah than did Hillel the Elder. And the fracture became so great that there was, as hard as this is to believe, there was a bloody coup in the Sanhedrin. And when I mean bloody, I don't mean figuratively. I mean people died. The clash was so great that the faction of Shammai decided to take the Sanhedrin by force. And what they did was they assembled all the Sanhedrin in a room, and there they killed some of the priests who followed the teachings of Hillel the Elder. They killed them. And after they took the Sanhedrin by force, the school, or the house as it's called, Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, issued some rulings called the 18 Edicts. And what these 18 edicts did was they imposed extraneous burdens on the Jews for living out the Torah. And Jesus, Yeshua himself, called them burdens. But you see, in Luke 11:46, he goes on to say this as well. He pronounced a woe on this house of Shammai, this ruling house of the Sanhedrin during his time. They ruled for about 100 years. Coincidentally, they fell from power the year that Yeshua began his ministry, 30 CE. But he pronounced a woe on this house when he said in Luke 11:46, woe to you as well, experts in the law. You weigh men down with heavy burdens, but you yourselves will not lift a finger to lighten their load. And why did the house of Shammai do this? Well, perhaps they thought that they were building bigger and better fences around the Torah, fences to help the Jews keep the mitzvot, the 613 commandments given by Moses. But perhaps also it is because they wanted to increase their power. They wanted to increase their power over the people. It was a very sad period in the history of the Sanhedrin. And if you want to read more about it, you can find it in both the Mishnah, in Shabbat, the section of the Mishnah called Shabbat, chapter 1. You can also read about it in the Tosefta. It's not make-believe. It really happened. And it happened during the formative years that Yeshua was born and growing up. And he studied at a school up in the Galilee that I've mentioned in an earlier broadcast. And he, in large part, followed the school of Hillel the Elder. In fact, if you read the teachings of Hillel the Elder, you will find a lot of congruence between Hillel the Elder's teachings and those of Yeshua. He did not follow the teachings of the most powerful house in the early 1st century CE, the house of Shammai. But I'm getting off track as usual. Sorry about that. The pools of Bethesda were on the eastern wall of the city toward the north, just above the temple complex. The name Bethesda means house of healing. When you see Beth in English, in a name, it means house of. So, house of healing. The infirm, the sick, were not allowed to enter the city walls. And for this reason, the pool was located outside the original city walls. Many miracles of healing occurred there. The pool is referenced in John chapter 5, verse 2. Now, just below these often miraculous waters was an area called Birket Israel, otherwise known as the sheep pool, as both of these were near what was called the sheep gate. Also north of the temple complex is where Jeremiah's grotto was located in the past. Our tour leader, one of them, believes that this is the location for the crucifixion. It's also been called Place of the Skull or Skull Hill. This is actually one of what was the 3 peaks of Mount Moriah. See, Mount Moriah had 3 peaks. The other 2 being where the temple was located, and there's one that was just completely shaved off. You can't even see a peak there today because it was shaved off. And then the royal stoa was a portico at the southern end of the temple complex, although another inaccuracy on this building, the royal stoa, in the model, they have put a tile roof, but it did not have a tile roof, although it's pictured with one in the model. Again, archaeology has made some tremendous discoveries since this model was built. So we spent a good deal of time there at the model, but then we went inside to an area of the museum that is called the Room of the Book. Now, it was here that we were able to see replicas of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, I thought this was interesting because, even though I had been to Israel only 5 years before this trip that I took in June. When I visited the Israel Museum in January of 2018, they had a little display, a very small display. It was like a box with a glass top. And in that room, called the room of the book, they keep the light very, very low because light helps disintegrate ancient artifacts. So they keep the light very, very low, and they tell you not to take pictures in that room and not to use your flashlight on your phone in that room. So you just have to do the best you can. If like my mother, you can't see in low light, then you're just out of luck. Okay. Because you just can't add any artificial light to that room. Now, back in 2018, they had this little display, and you could look through that glass top and you could see an actual fragment of one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I believe that it was a segment from the Isaiah scroll, because you see, they were all found in fragments, and they assembled at the time when they were discovered. They assembled the greatest archaeologists of that day, and they met together, and over a period of time, they reconstructed the scrolls, and they were able to piece together entire books. So it was an amazing feat. It was an amazing miracle of God. But my point is that they would just take a little fragment of the actual Dead Sea Scroll, and they would put it in this airtight environment, airtight low light environment, so you could actually cast your eyes on an actual piece of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, when I was there a couple of months ago, I looked for that display, and it was no longer there. The only thing you could see of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the room of the book was replicas. And so I guess in that 5-year period, I don't know if they determined that it was just too risky to keep doing that. It just caused too much deterioration, or what the rationale was. And I tried to ask a docent, but she couldn't understand English, and my Hebrew wasn't that good. So I wasn't able to ask her, about that. And then it just sort of fell by the wayside. But at any rate, I thought that was an interesting point. There's been some controversy over whether or not the scrolls were actually written in the area known as Qumran, or if they were written in Jerusalem and then transported to Qumran. But regardless, they were written somewhere in the time period of 2nd century BCE to 1st century BCE. And the Dead Sea Scrolls contained, as I mentioned, fragments of every single book in the Tanakh, except for the book of Esther. And apparently, the book of Esther was considered controversial even back then. There was great discussion years later as to whether or not to include the book of Esther in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible, in the canon of the Old Testament. The decision was finally made to do so. But there were some other hotly contested books that did not make it into the Hebrew canon, into the Hebrew Bible. And some of those were 1st and 2nd Maccabees, but they were found in the caves at Qumran. And also, the books of Enoch were found in the caves at Qumran, but they also did not make it into the final 24 books of the Hebrew Bible. Now, the Ethiopian church, which is sort of a it's sort of similar to the Catholic Church, but the Ethiopian Jews, decided to include the books of Enoch in its canon, in that congregation. In their canon, they include the books of Enoch. So, even the Hebrew Bible is not the same across all practicing groups. There's some extra books, like in Christianity, you might say, using the very broader term of Christianity. The Catholic Church includes books in its canon that the Protestant Church does not. So, before 1947, when these scrolls were discovered, and isn't it interesting that they were discovered at about the same time Israel was reconstituted as a world nation, a haven once again for the Jews. Before 1947, our oldest scrolls were from the 10th century CE. So the Dead Sea Scrolls were 1,200 years older. But the Aleppo Codex was the oldest of that group. It was found in a synagogue in Aleppo, Syria. That's why it's called the Aleppo Codex, because of where it was found. It's named after the town in which it was found. A codex is a document that is formed by taking fragments of parchment and gluing them onto actual pages. So that's why it's called a codex. The Aleppo Codex is very accurate, even down to its vowels, as accurate as humanly possible. And you can see that codex in the Israel Museum. Now, we didn't go see it when we were there on this trip, but you can see it there. Even with its accuracy, it is missing some books because in 1948, the Muslims set the Aleppo synagogue on fire. And although most of the Aleppo Codex was saved, not all of it was saved. A second codex called the Leningrad Codex is slightly younger than the Aleppo. This one is in, you guessed it, Leningrad, Russia. So you'd have to go to Russia to see the actual Leningrad Codex. One of the Mores on our tour, Andrew Gabriel Roth, shared about a 464 BCE date for an Aramaic scroll that is older than the Aleppo Codex. You can tell, even as bad as I am at math, if we found the Aleppo in the 10th century CE, then, you're looking at a difference of about 500 years between the Aleppo Codex and the Aramaic scroll that Andrew was talking about. But this Aramaic scroll that was 500 years older, it contains 4 of the 5 books of the Torah. But some in the 500s CE, some Aramaic scrolls from the 500s CE fill in those gaps, and a 550 CE manuscript of Aramaic of 1st and 2nd Maccabees is in existence as well. So we had, Andrew's point was, we had some older Aramaic scrolls in addition to those, the Aleppo and the Leningrad in Hebrew. And in my blog on day 12 of my trip, I posted an old article from the New Yorker magazine. It was written back in 1969. That's when the follow-up article was written. There were 2 articles, and I've listed both of them in my blog. Great articles. I really encourage you to go check them out. I'm just not going to take the time to go into them today, okay? But the first one was written in 1955. not long after the process was completed on restoring the Dead Sea Scrolls. And then the same author, the same reporter, wrote a follow-up article in 1969. So go check those links out and read about the process of restoring the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's some miraculous stories in there. You know, Hasatan, the Satan really tried hard to prevent these scrolls from ever being assembled and seeing the light of day, you might say. All right. We left the museum a little after noon on that day, and we rode our bus over to something called Mishkan Yehudah, a large Jewish outdoor market. Its nickname colloquially is called the Shuk. And this was on a Friday morning that we were at the Israel Museum. And so it was that evening that the second Shabbat of our trip began. And so this outdoor market is a huge one in the newer city of Jerusalem. And so it was extremely busy. So we were there in the final hours, I'd say from about 1 o'clock until about 3 o'clock. And about 3 to 4 in the afternoon, the shops would start closing because the shopkeepers wanted to be home in time to celebrate Shabbat with their families. So it was very busy. We stayed and we shopped for about an hour and a half. I bought some magnificent spices at a spice store there, and they had them out in the open air. You could just scoop into a plastic bag what you wanted, and I was able to easily take those on the plane with me. But we were there for about an hour and a half. And then, in the heat of the afternoon, we decided we would walk back to our hotel. And one of our guides was with us, and he said, "Oh, I know the way, you know." So we were like, "Okay, you know, we trust you and all that." But we got lost. We got a bit lost and went out of our way a little bit. But it was a hot walk, but we finally got back. And so when we returned to the hotel, we gathered in the hotel lobby at sundown, and we lit the Shabbat candles to start the Shabbat. And then we had dinner, and that was day 12 of our trip. So I've got some more time. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to day 13, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about the second Shabbat that we spent in Israel. And oh my goodness, wow. We got to visit the great synagogue of Jerusalem. I never would have dreamed that I would get to go into such an amazing place. Whew. We got up very early that morning, and we headed out to the great synagogue. We had a sparse breakfast, you know, a Shabbat breakfast. And we walked to the great synagogue. It wasn't far from our hotel. And it's a beautiful morning. Baruch Hashem. Praise the Lord. And on the Sabbath, you don't see many cars driving through the Jewish areas of the city. That's because we were staying in a very Orthodox area, and the Orthodox do not drive on Shabbat. So there weren't many cars. For the most part, we were walking out in the street because there weren't many cars. And it was very quiet. Just, you would see people walking like we were, a lot of people walking. And so when we went into the synagogue, like the other women, I sat in the women's section, which was up in the balcony. And the men in our group went down to the main floor where they sat off to the side, toward the back on the side. Now, based on my experiences at Synagogue Levi, I was better prepared this go around, but something that I was unprepared for was the gorgeous prayers that were sung at the beginning of the services. Oh my goodness. If you love to hear men's choirs, you would have loved to hear this singing. And it was not like chanting. Some of it was a little bit like chanting, but it was without instruments for the most part. It was without instruments. I think, I'm trying to think, was it all without instruments? I believe it was all a cappella without instruments. But somebody can, if any of our party sees this, you can correct me in the comments. But I mean, it was harmony. The men sang in beautiful, beautiful harmony. There was a leader, and there was a small whiteboard, and on the small whiteboard would be written the hymn or the song that they were going to sing. And then the cantor would start. And a little bit of an interesting aside, I have a first cousin who's he's about 8 years older than I am, lives up in Chicago. And he told me not too long ago when I started studying Hebrew, because he knows some Hebrew also. He studied Hebrew. He told me that he was the cantor in a Reformed synagogue. Now, this guy, like me, we were both raised Southern Baptist. Okay, so I guess he's another member of my family who studied Judaism, like me. But I thought that was really cool and really a little odd that a non-Jew would be a cantor in a Jewish synagogue. Cantor is a word which means music leader. And so that was just a real surprise to me. But at any rate, yeah, he performed this service in a more reformed, less conservative, more reformed synagogue. And the music would be different as well in a reformed synagogue. In fact, he sent me a YouTube link to a beautiful piece of music that was written by the long-term cantor who preceded him, who was at that synagogue in Chicago for several decades. It was commissioned by him, and he wrote this gorgeous, gorgeous piece of music. At any rate, I digress again. Let me get back on track here. But the music was so beautiful that it brought tears to my eyes. I just never would have dreamed. Now, at Synagogue Levi, they mostly chanted. Okay, they did not. I don't remember there being any three-part harmony or harmony at all at Levi. It was very call and response. There were several different cantors as opposed to one central cantor at Levi. They would take turns, and one man would do the call, one would chant, and then there would be a chanted response from the other men assembled on the floor of the synagogue. But there was like a choir of men at the great synagogue of Jerusalem. It was amazing. It was just amazing. And in my blog post, I didn't post this, but I may go back for day 13 and try to do this. But I surreptitiously recorded a little bit, just about a minute and a half, on my phone of a little bit of the singing, because it was just so beautiful. I wanted to take a little bit of that away with me, and it was just so meaningful. I just can't express. Well, it was a beautiful service, and it lasted a couple of hours, from about 8 to about 10 or so, thereabouts, maybe 10:30, 8:30 to 10:30, somewhere around in there. But it was a couple of hours. And after the service was over, we walked over to a complex called Baptist House. Now, that seems a strange place to have a meal on Shabbat, doesn't it? But Baptist House is run by people who are Baptists, but they are very they're very messianic type Baptists, you might say, kind of like me, I guess. I mean, I've said before to those of you who may have caught this in an earlier broadcast, I'm married to a Baptist. We worship in the Baptist church. We're leaders in our Baptist church, but while one foot is in the Baptist church, I also have the other foot in the firmly planted in the living out of the teachings of the Old Testament, because I do that as an offering to God, as a fragrant offering. I do it out of love, not to earn my own salvation or to increase my own holiness. I can't do that anyway. It's impossible, I believe, for a person to increase their own holiness. A person can be obedient, but it's the Spirit of God who increases someone's holiness, because that gives him all the glory as opposed to giving me all the glory, or anyone else for that matter, all the glory. So at any rate, we went to the Baptist House for a lunch, a Shabbat lunch. It was pre-prepared, and we just opened our boxed lunches, and we ate and we fellowshipped. We sang wonderful songs, and the Baptist House has been there for a number of years. I don't know that it would be able to be established in the land now, but the Baptists got in when it was easier to get in, and the land was cheaper, and they've maintained a presence here in the newer part of Jerusalem. They've maintained a presence in Jerusalem, all these decades, and they were kind enough to host us and provide for us a place to have lunch, and so that was a nice respite. It was nice and cool in there. And so after lunch and worship, we came back to the hotel. Some of us rested, some of us shopped, and so forth for the rest of the day. A couple of friends and I walked into the old city, and we had already thoroughly explored the Jewish quarter. So we walked through part of the Christian quarter, where the booths are maintained by Arab Christians. And we returned to the Western Wall, where we prayed again for a few minutes. And I was struck again by the many children that are in Jerusalem. It really hits you how Americans are not reproducing at a very high rate when you see the average young Jewish family. Most of the time, they have 4 to 5 children. 4 to 5 children. It's lovely. And I've mentioned before that in studying my ancestry, when I've looked at my ancestors from decades and centuries ago, it was not at all uncommon for them to have 8 children, 10 children, 12 children. And after a spouse lost his or her husband or wife, for them to remarry and have more children. So it wasn't at all uncommon for a woman to have 10 to 12 children. For a man, I have one relative who fathered over 20 children because he had wife 1, and wife 1 died, and then he married wife 2, and then wife 2 died, and then he had wife 3, and his successive wives were younger than he was, and so he was able, over a period of 25 to 30 years, to father over 20 children. It wasn't uncommon. And so, we're shooting ourselves in the foot in this country because we're not having enough children to repopulate the country. On my way around the Christian quarter, I was sort of looking for a shop of a famous artist that I had heard about. His name is Victor Lepesian, and Vic, as he's called, specializes in Armenian Christian ceramics and pottery. I had given up on finding his shop because I was looking in the Christian quarter, not the Armenian quarter. Duh. And as I was walking toward the Jaffa Gate, the Jaffa Gate, Jaffa as it's sometimes called, I was on the final leg of the walk, if you'll pardon the pun. And as I passed by this shop, I looked up and I saw Vic over the door. And I looked in and I thought, elderly gentleman looks familiar. And I'd seen photos of Victor, but I'd never actually met him. And so something said, go in that shop. And because I've been on his website. So I went in. I'm not very shy. If you hadn't figured that out, I'm really not. And I walked in and I said, would you happen to be Victor Lapetian? And he said, well, yes, I am. And I was like, oh my goodness, I have wanted to meet you for so long. So I talked with him for about 5 minutes. My friends had gone on outside the Jaffa Gate and waited for me. So I didn't tarry, but I talked to him for about 5 minutes and purchased a mezuzah from him because I wanted a mezuzah for my front door here at home. And he had one that would be perfect. And so I purchased one, and then I went and caught up with my friends. And so we had dinner, and after dinner, we had more shopping and visiting with friends and so forth. And we knew that we only had one more day on our trip. And it's been such a wonderful trip. That night, I visited with a family of Arab Christians that I met in my earlier travels. So it's wonderful to have that fellowship and catch up. And one of the things I discovered on my trip that I don't think I've mentioned this, is that when I would post my blog posts, I would also post them to Facebook. So if you go to my Resplendent Daughter Ministries Facebook page and you scroll back, you can find my blog posts on there also. If that's easier for you than going to my blog. But Facebook throttled me during the trip. I don't know if it's because I was posting from a foreign country. I don't know if it's that they're somewhat anti-Semitic. I just don't know. But they would put me on restriction for 24 hours. They did that 3 or 4 times during the trip. And I really don't know why. But it caused me to be a little bit behind in posting because they wouldn't let me post. They wouldn't let me comment. They wouldn't even let me like comments. So it was extremely frustrating. They started by suspending me for an hour one time, and I had no idea why. They never tell you why. They just say, you're going to be restricted for an hour. You're going to be restricted for a day. And it hasn't happened since I got back home here to the States. It hasn't happened. So I don't know. It was just very, very weird. But at any rate, it delayed some of my postings. I was very faithful to post every day that I was there. Okay, so that's days 12 and 13 of my trip. My goodness, I was able to get 2 days in today. And that means that we will only have one more broadcast on my travel log from Israel. And so that will be on the 30th of this month. And then after the 30th, we will, and that will, I'm just going to go ahead and warn you, that will probably be a shorter broadcast because I'll probably just do that day. And I may make some remarks about the travel day, but it won't be long. It won't be much because let's be honest, travel it's boring. Okay. I mean, the air travel, the getting there and the getting home, it's just kind of like snooze rama. All right. It's not interesting. So I'm not going to bore you with that. So it may be a little shorter broadcast next week. I'm sure you'll understand if that's the case. And then we will be back to the book of Ruth and we'll be in chapter 3. So if you want to go back and review the prior videos or review that, at my blog site, you can do that, or you can also review it on my YouTube channel. You can review those videos. See, the thing about Messianic Lamb Network is they only keep my latest video for a week, and then they replace it with the one I do the following week. But if you want to go back and see the previous ones, the best place to find them all together is on my YouTube channel, which is Gena, Gina. Yeah, it's my dad's name was Eugene. I'm just glad they didn't name me Eugenia, okay? Because I mean, honestly, I just don't think I'm a Eugenia. But anyway, GenaHood, Gena Hood 2818, Gena Hood 2818 on YouTube. Okay. All right. Well, again, thank you for being here today. I really was blessed. I'm always blessed getting to be with you. I thank you for tuning in, whether you tune in live or whether you tune in as someone who comes back and watches later because you work during the regular work day, and so you can't tune in live. But at any rate, I just appreciate you and I thank you, and we will see you next week.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hoogie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.